So you think the EU is a nice, legitimate organization that represents the interest of the European population? Think again. It is not. There are 5 reasons why you should be very afraid of the European Union. Number 1. The EU doesn't represent European values. That's right. The EU talks a lot about European values, and it claims to be representing or somehow defending these values. Values such as the right to self-determination, freedom of expression, the concept of a nation state, and even the idea of democracy itself. These are indeed European values, and they are a part of our proud philosophical heritage. But the thing is that the EU opposes these values. We have a European Parliament, right? No, we haven't. The European Parliament is not a real parliament. It is simply an advisory body. It has little influence or power. It cannot create or repeal legislation. Only the EU Commission can do this. And the EU Commission is basically a select group of people who don't necessarily need the support of the people in their own home countries to do what they're doing in the EU. It is true that the European Council consists of individuals who are elected in their own country, and there is 1 person per member state. But there are 2 problems. The first problem is that representatives are bound by their oath of office to represent the general interest of the EU as a whole, rather than their home country's interests. This is how the EU already undermines the interests of nation states, and therefore of the people, by its very design. The second problem is that the EU itself, as a separate entity, does not have the support of the people. The EU rules over people without people's consent. In 2005, after the Netherlands and France voted against the establishment of the EU constitution, the referenda that were planned in Czech Republic, Denmark, Ireland, Poland, Portugal and United Kingdom were cancelled, and they just went on with it. By ignoring the will of the people, the existence of the EU is not consistent with the concept of democracy. So even though the members of the European Council do have the support of their individual nation states, because they're elected, they do have to swear loyalty to an organization that undermines these very same nation states, and at the same time doesn't need the support nor permission of these nation states to do so. So by its very design, the EU cannot represent European values. They oppose the will of the people by their mere existence, and therefore they oppose the right to self-determination and the concept of democracy. So no, the EU does not represent European values. Number 2. The EU doesn't accept resistance. Just like the Soviet Union, the European Union likes to weaken the feeling of national identity of the different types of Europeans. Making every member state multicultural is a great way to do this. You won't feel like you're in France anymore if you go outside and all you can see are Islamic headscarves everywhere. So as you've probably noticed, the EU is very obsessed with so-called diversity. Now, Poland and Hungary don't agree with this, and therefore the EU wants to force these countries to become multicultural. This again opposes the right to self-determination of the people and the right to democracy. So even though the Hungarians voted against the migration quota in October of 2016, the EU wants to literally force the Hungarians to allow Muslims in their society, putting the lives of their women and children in danger. Even though it is their own country, it is simply disgusting. Something similar is happening to Poland. Even though the Polish have accepted hundreds of thousands of refugees from Ukraine, the Polish do not want Muslims to come live in their country. And in contrast to other European countries, the Polish are being correctly represented by their government. The political party Law and Justice, PIS, has the majority of the votes. The EU therefore has to find an excuse to put pressure on the Polish government, and they start complaining about the fact that PIS recently replaced some judges to fight corruption. And even though many of the judges in Poland have been in their position since the communist era, it is admittedly a very shady practice. But when the former Polish government did exactly the same, the EU did not have a problem with it, because the former Polish government was a pro-EU government, but now that an anti-EU government does exactly the same thing as the former government, it is suddenly a problem. A fun fact is that this former government was led by none other than Donald Tusk. Let that sink in for a while. Number 3. The EU is an ideological bubble of people who do not like alternative viewpoints. I can totally recommend you to listen to some of the debates that take place in the European Parliament. They can be found by clicking on the link I've attached in the description. What you'll see is that many of the people in the European Parliament seem to have an incredibly simple worldview. This worldview can basically be summarized in one single sentence. The EU is good, and the people who don't agree with this are all populists, who are driven by or related to xenophobia, Islamophobia, sexism, fascism, fake news, intolerance, and tada, Putin. These people are living in a dream world. And to be frank, most people in the European Parliament are not intelligent at all. Let's take a look.
Populism, the rise in extremism, populism and xenophobia and intolerance.
Hate speakers are now even in power in some countries. And hate speech is not what freedom of expression is.
Almost any female politician will have experienced hate speech on her social media accounts. It's a widespread phenomenon that didn't start with the internet. It's important not to forget that the core of the problem is not social media, it's sexism and racism.
Hate speech, populism, fake news on social media requires a European response.
Countering all expressions of discrimination, violence and intolerance is a priority for all of us.
We see how the social and digital media are becoming a powerful tool for propaganda, populism and hate speech.
Facing up to new political realities such as the threat from populism to representative democracy.
Free communication of thought and opinion is one of the most fundamental rights of people. People can write and speak freely but should not abuse that right.
Misogyny, we're seeing in Islamophobia.
This is the European Parliament, and things like this should not be tolerated by you or me.
So what about the freedom of expression? Wasn't that actually a European value also? Apparently not. The EU is currently working with social media companies to limit the freedom of expression. Again, the general line of reasoning is incredibly simple. It goes as follows. Freedom of expression is important, but it should not be quote-unquote misused by populists, xenophobes, intolerant people, and so on. In other words, they don't give a damn about the freedom of expression. Because if they did, they would also allow people to say things they don't agree with, as established by Voltaire. So first they rule over people without permission, and when these people want to get rid of them, they try to limit the freedom of expression. What does that remind you of? Maybe that's why these Eastern Europeans don't like it. Number 4. The EU has an enormous budget to create fake news and revisionist history. Yes, the EU is probably the most powerful creator of fake news on the entire continent. They even created an entire museum which represents their Orwellian version of European history. In this museum, no attention is given to Christianity and to most of the Enlightenment. For the European Union, the story starts at the moment of the French Revolution. Not surprisingly, the museum does address two carefully selected issues from before the French Revolution: slavery and colonialism. It has an entire room about the First and Second World Wars, and strangely, Karl Marx and socialism receive a special spot in the EU museum. And the top floor is all about the EU itself, presenting it as the great solution to all the misery of the 20th century. It is actually quite funny that they don't seem to realize that the French Revolution actually resembles what they are most afraid of themselves: the people overthrowing their unelected leaders. So if you're ever in Brussels, don't forget to visit this propaganda museum. It is actually quite interesting to see. Number 5. The top positions are taken by radicals. That's right, the top positions in the EU are held by some incredibly radical people. Throughout human history, the most dangerous people were the ones who held grandiose ideas, often about a utopia. These type of people are so obsessed with their future utopia that they can't think clearly anymore. Opposing arguments are not addressed anymore in an open and rational manner, but instead are shoved aside. People who represent opposing ideas are usually labeled Bolshevists, proletariat, populist. Now keep in mind what I just said and let's take a look at this guy.
Have a new strategy of change for this European Union. And when I'm talking about change, I'm talking about real change. Not what Mr. Kamal has said is calling for. He has used, I think, at least 10 times the word change is an intervention, but what he is calling change, I'm calling it blocking all progress. It's going out of the euro, it's breaking up Schengen, it's stalling labour mobility, it's abandoning all European common policies. So less integration, less Europe. That's no change, that's regression, dear colleagues. Regression it is. No. What does it mean, the word conservative? Well, nothing, yeah, that's a good explanation. But if it means anything, that is mean that status quo. Conservatism is status quo, and that is what we don't want with this European Union today. What we are doing now is exactly the same, not on economics, but on the fundamental of not applying the rules, closing our eyes on what is happening. And no, Mr. Orbán, it's not against Hungary. You have not the right to say that these people here are fighting against the Hungarian interest. It's the opposite is true. It's not your interest, but your interest is not the Hungarian interest. What we are defending here is Hungarian democracy and the interest of the Hungarian citizens.
Yes, this is what history's most dangerous people look like. World War II did not happen because of nation states. World War II happened because of dangerous ideologues. The thing with this idea of a European globalist utopia superstate is not that it is against these grandiose ideologies. The problem is that it is too much like these type of grandiose ideologies. The EU superstate is simply another version of a perfect utopia invented by some dangerous radical. We can create a perfect world if only all these populists would shut up. If only we could take away their freedom of expression. If only we could fill in the blanks. That's how it goes, people. That's how it goes. So there are 5 reasons why you should be afraid of the EU. Number 1, the EU doesn't represent European values. Number 2, the EU doesn't accept resistance. Number 3, the EU is an ideological bubble of people who don't like alternative viewpoints. Number 4, the EU has an enormous budget to create fake news and revisionist history. And number 5, the top positions are taken by dangerous radicals. And especially the combination of these 5 things is a recipe for real disaster. This is Paul from debatetheleft.com. If you like the content, please subscribe or consider supporting my work through Patreon. And most importantly, never stop debating the left on Islam. Take care.